Hey everyone, how's it going, and welcome to this brand new tutorial series on how to create the classic game Pong in Unity. Before we get started, I'd like to let you know that we also have this entire series written out on our website at www.infogamerhub.com. There's some great reference material that you'll find in the written portion of these lessons that we will also refer to in these videos. Now, as you can see, this Pong series is divided up into 6 lessons, and we're going to try and get through these lessons as quick as possible because after all, it's only Pong. And the last thing that I'd like to note before we get started is that you can sign up to become a member on our website, and then you'll get this entire series, including the videos, ad-free. Now let's get started. So here I have Unity opened, and as you can see, I already have created my own version of Pong, which we'll be using throughout this series. But now I'd like to play through this project so that you can see what we'll be creating throughout this series. So here I have a main menu scene with a title and a play button, as well as some other visual components. But when I click the play button, it loads us into a game scene where we have our playing field, a ball, and 2 paddles. I can move the paddles with WASD and J and L, and then when I click the space bar, the ball will start moving, and the ball interacts with our paddles, as well as the end zones. When the ball collides with an end zone, the opposite player scores a point. We then also have a game over screen when one of the players wins. Now that should give you an idea of what you'll end up with by the end of this series. Now to get started, the first thing that you'll need to do is create a new Unity project, and I recommend selecting the 2D template when you create your project. Now if you don't know how to create a Unity project, you can watch our tutorial on how to do so and then come back to this video. Now once you have your Unity project created, you should have a default scene which has a main camera and a directional light. Now we want to take this scene and turn it into our game scene, which should look like what I have right now in my game view. But to do this, we first need to create or download some assets. And these assets are going to be sprites or 2D images. But before we download them, we need to create a folder in our project to save them into. So in our project window, we want to right-click in our Assets folder, go up to Create, and then select Folder. You can then rename this folder to be Sprites. Once you have this folder created, you can then go over to the documentation for our Pong Lesson 1. And if you scroll down, right here you'll see 4 hyperlinks. Each of these hyperlinks is an image that you can save into your Sprites folder. Once you have all 4 of these images saved to your project, we can then go back to Unity. Once back inside Unity, you want to select each one of these images and change the texture type in the inspector to Sprite, 2D, and UI. Once you've done that to all 4 of these images, we can now start building our game scene. So for the next part of this lesson, I'm going to go through each object in our hierarchy and explain what it is, and I'll show you some of the key values that you need to set in the inspector. But for reference, you can also go to the documentation for this lesson, and right here I have the entire hierarchy with links to a screenshot of the inspector for most of the objects. And so if I go through the hierarchy too fast, or if the inspector is hard to read in this video, then I would recommend taking your time and go through those screenshots. So first off, we have our main camera, which should just be the default camera that was created with your scene. The main values to be aware of for this object in the inspector are the clear flag, which is set to solid color, the background, which is set to white, the projection, which is set to orthographic, and the size, which is set to 8. Next up, we have the directional light, which for this project can actually be deleted from our hierarchy. And the reason why we can delete it is because this is a 2D project and we're only using unlit 2D sprites and UI elements. Next up, we have this environment object, which is just an empty game object, but we have a few objects that are children to this environment object. The first child is my background object. This is a sprite object, and so it has the sprite renderer component, and the sprite field is set to our background image, and then the scale of this object in the Y direction is set to 1.8. Next up, we have the right wall object. This is an empty object with a box collider 2D attached to it. This object has the tag wall, and it's been moved over to 4.5 in the X direction. And then you want to make sure that you size up the box collider so that it spans the entire length of our plane field. You can then duplicate this object and rename it to left wall, and then reposition this object to -4.5 in the X direction. This will put it on the opposite side of our plane field. Next up, we have another empty game object with the box collider 2D attached to it. This object is called end1. It has a tag called end1. Its Y position is 7. Its box collider has isTrigger set to true. And you want to size this box collider so that it spans the entire width of our plane field. You can then duplicate this object, rename it to end2, change the tag to end2, and then set the position to -7. This will put it down at the bottom of our plane field. The last object that's child to our environment object is the midline. This is a sprite object, so it has the sprite renderer component, and the sprite field is set to our line image. You then want to scale this object out in the X and Y directions so that it spans the entire width of our plane field and is the thickness that you want the line to be. Now that takes care of our plane field, and so next we'll talk about the UI objects. So first up, we have our canvas object, which is created by default anytime you create any UI element. But the only thing that I've changed for this object is that I've changed the UI scaling mode of the canvas scaler component to scale with screen size. And then I've set the reference resolution X to 1080 and the Y to 1920. This is just something that I like to do for most of my games so that the UI objects will scale properly for resolutions of different mobile devices. Now the first object that is a child to our canvas is this object called score1, which is a UI text object. For this object, I have the anchors set to the bottom of our screen. I then have some padding on the right and left. The position is set to 75 in the Y, and the height is 100. I then have the text field set to 0, and then I have best fit set to true and max size set to 100. This object is the 0 in the bottom left corner of our screen. You can then duplicate this object, rename it to score2, change the anchor points of this second object to the top of our screen, set the Y position to -75, and change the alignment to the right. This is for the 0 in the top right corner of our screen. The next two objects are also UI text objects, which are used for displaying the input keys for each player. For the first one, I have the anchors set to the bottom of our screen. There's still the padding on the left and right. The Y position is 150 and the height is 50. The text value is then set to this string. The alignment is centered, and then we have best fit set to true with the max size at 50. You can then duplicate this object to make the second display for the input keys. This second object has the anchor set to the top of our screen. The Y position is set to -150. And then we have a different string for the text value, and everything else is the same. Next up, we have our Game Over panel, which is just the default UI panel object, but I've set the color to be completely transparent. This object then has some child objects as well. The first child is our Game Over text, which is a UI text object for displaying which player wins. For this object, you just want to make sure that you position it somewhat near the top of your playing field. The text value is set to the string player_wins. This will be so that we can display whether player 1 or player 2 wins. We then want to set the alignment to center. We also have best fit set to true, and the max size is 150. The last UI object that we have is a default UI button. You want to reposition and size this button so that it's somewhere in the bottom half of your playing field. For the image of this button, I've set the color to be completely transparent, and we'll worry about the on-click function for this button in a later lesson. But the default UI button comes with a child text object, and for this object I just have the text value set to the string main menu, and then I have best fit set to true with the max size at 150. Now the last object in the hierarchy that we need to talk about for this lesson is the event system, but this object is just created by default when you create your first UI object. Now once you have your scene created, there's one more thing that we're going to do for this lesson, and that is we're going to select our game over panel and we're going to disable it in the hierarchy. And there you go, we now have the basic environment and UI created for our game scene. Now finally, make sure that you save your scene. I've created this folder called Scenes, and I've saved this scene as Game Scene.